The monitor screen divides the night into two realities. On the left side, the living room of the estate, designer furniture, curated art on the walls, a fireplace that is never used. Richard sits in a leather armchair, tablet in hand, watching something no one should be watching. His face is illuminated by the cold blue glow of the screen. His eyes do not blink. On the right side, David's bedroom. A twin bed nestled under a window, a teddy bear fallen on the floor, and Catherine, sitting on the edge of the mattress, holding that bear with care, as if it were a sacred artifact. She sings. Her voice is low, almost a whisper, but the high-fidelity microphone captures every note with digital clarity. It is an old song, with words in a dialect no one sings anymore. No one even knows how to sing it. David is lying down, eyes half open, floating in that nebulous state between nightmare and waking. His small body is tense under the down comforter. "Catherine," he murmurs, his voice still heavy with sleep. "How do you know the song my real mommy used to sing? She died when I was a baby." On the monitor, on the left side, Richard's face undergoes a transformation. That expression of superiority, the one he has cultivated for years, the one that protects him from anything that might touch him, vanishes completely. Something replaces it. A tremor. A recognition he is not equipped to handle. His hands shake. The tablet almost slips. Richard pauses the video with convulsive fingers. Then he rewinds, frantically searching for the previous session, for the bedroom camera, for the living room camera, for the footage he has collected over the last few days, hoping to find negligence, hoping to find a legitimate reason. But what he is finding is something very different, something he doesn't have the tools to process. 3 days earlier, David is 7 years old. His eyes still have that spark children possess before they learn the world wasn't made to let them shine. But this spark is dim in David. Very dim. Like a candle about to be snuffed out. His mother died when he was 11 months old. Viral pneumonia, an infection most children survive, but not all, not Laura. Richard doesn't talk about Laura. He removed her photos from the public walls of the house. He keeps a few in an album locked in a drawer in his study. He doesn't take David to any of the places she used to go, because going to those places would mean having to feel, and Richard is a man who does not allow himself to feel, not since he felt her leaving this world. So David grew up in a house where his mother is a noun no one mentions, a ghost haunting the hallways, but whose name is never spoken. Catherine arrived when David was 3, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair always pulled back in a bun, hands that seemed created to clean houses and cook warm meals. Richard hired her through a high-end agency. He didn't interview her personally. His executive assistants did that. All that mattered was that she had references, that she was competent, and that she didn't ask questions. For the first few months, Catherine was exactly that. A professional woman who completed her tasks and disappeared. Richard rarely saw her. And when he did, she was invisible. The kind of invisibility a good housekeeper cultivates when working for a man who doesn't want to be bothered by her humanity. But something slowly changed. David began to change first. He went from a terrified boy, the kind of child who wakes up in the middle of the night screaming, whose nightmares seem to have physical form, to a boy who still had fear, but had someone to run to. And Catherine changed too. She started leaving cookies in his room. She started reading stories that weren't on the approved list of educational and appropriate literature. She started painting with him in the backyard, creating things that had no form or function, only color and movement. Richard didn't like that. He needs structure, Richard said in a conversation with Catherine a few months ago. Not sentimentality. They were in the kitchen. David was in his room, supposedly doing homework. Catherine was washing dishes, her hands immersed in hot water, skin reddened by the heat. The boy needs to cry, Richard continued. He needs to learn that life is hard, that things end, that you simply move on. Catherine continued washing the dishes, but Richard saw her jaw tighten. "I respect your opinion, sir," she said, and there was something in the way she said it. Respect, but not consent. It's not an opinion. It's a fact. You are making the boy soft, dependent. That night, Richard made a decision. He hired a security firm. Hidden cameras, subtle microphones, not everywhere, he wasn't paranoid, but in the common areas, and in David's room. His official justification to himself was safety. But the truth was different. The truth was that he saw something between Catherine and David that scared him. Something that seemed to threaten the order he had built. The order of silence, of distance, of the way he had decided David should learn to live. Alone, closed off, safe in his own coldness. And Richard needed a reason to remove her. A reason that wasn't just, "She is being kind to my son." Because that, no one would understand. On the first day of recording, Richard is in his study when he opens the app. The interface is simple. 5 cameras, 4 showing the common areas, 1 showing David's bedroom. He selects the bedroom camera in real time. Catherine is sitting on the bed next to David. The boy is awake, but with that empty look of someone who has just woken from a bad dream. His sheets are damp with sweat. His face is blotchy from tears. "I had a bad dream," David murmurs. "I know, honey," Catherine replies. "But I'm here. You are safe." She hugs him. And it isn't that formal hug, the hug a nanny is supposed to give. It is the hug of someone who loves him. It is the hug of a mother. Richard looks at the timestamp on the video. 2:47 a.m. David should be asleep. Catherine should be in her own quarters resting for the workday. But here she is at 2:47 a.m., holding a boy who is not her son, whispering words Richard can't hear clearly through the camera, but which seem to be comforting. Cheap sentimentality, he thinks. But as he watches, something happens. Catherine keeps holding David and he slowly, very slowly begins to relax. His body stops shaking. His face regains color. And then, with the same gentleness, she lays him down again and begins to sing. It is a quiet song. A song that Richard, even with the camera's microphone, can barely pick up. But he hears enough to freeze him completely. The song is a lullaby. A song in an old dialect. A song he knows. Because this is the song Laura used to sing. Richard freezes the screen. His heart is beating irregularly. Sweat begins to bead on his forehead. He places the tablet on the desk as if it burned his hands. How does Catherine know this song? No one knows this song. Laura learned it from her own mother, a woman of Appalachian descent who died before Richard even met Laura. It is a family song, a song that belongs only to the echoes of Richard's memory. And Catherine, this woman he hired through an agency, whose standard references he never actually read, whose life before being his nanny he never investigated, knows this song. He picks up the phone. His hands still tremble as he dials. "I want a full report," he says to the man on the other end of the line. "Catherine's background, family, everything. I want to know everything about her." The voice on the other end remains professional. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. How long do you want us to take?" "I want it tomorrow." Richard hangs up. He looks again at the frozen screen. Catherine in black and white holding David. David safe. David calm. David loved. And Richard. Richard feels the world he built start to crumble. Because somewhere in this woman, somewhere in this story he doesn't know, is an answer that changes everything. And he isn't sure he's ready to find out what it is. Richard doesn't sleep that night. He stays in the study with the doors closed, the tablet in his lap, reviewing recordings. Not just the singing. He rewinds. Days, weeks, months of video stored in the cloud, waiting to be watched by eyes that never would. His eyes. What he sees turns him into someone he doesn't recognize. Monday afternoon, Catherine and David in the yard. She holds a child-sized brush in his hand, guiding him over a white sheet of paper. There are no instructions, no corrections. Just, "Look at that beautiful color. What do you think it represents?" David thinks for a while. Then he says, "Sadness, but the sadness that looks pretty when the day ends." Catherine smiles, a smile that isn't for him to see. It's a smile she gives to her own heart. Tuesday night. David waking up again with a nightmare. Catherine sitting on the bed, that toy box beside her. She pulls out a doll, a wooden horse painted with faded colors. "This horse belonged to a very special boy," she says. "A boy who was just as brave as you. And every time he was afraid, he rode this horse and galloped far away from the fear. Want to try?" David takes the horse. His small fingers touch the worn wood. He places it on his chest and closes his eyes. In a few minutes, he is asleep. Wednesday morning. Catherine helping David tie his shoes. He tries alone. Fails. Tries again. Fails. Starts to get frustrated. That kind of frustration kids get that can turn into crying in a heartbeat. Catherine doesn't take the shoe from his hands. Instead, she sits on the floor next to him and says, "You know, when I was little, it took me 3 months to learn this. 3 months. And you've been trying since yesterday. You're already much faster than me." David doesn't cry. He tries again. And this time, although the knot is crooked, he succeeds. Catherine hugs him as if he had won a war. Richard watches all this and feels something shift inside him, something he packed into boxes when Laura died, something he swore never to let out again. Anger suddenly doesn't seem like a legitimate motive, but he pushes the thought away. He goes back to the moment Catherine sings. He puts the song on loop, listens again, and again, and again, until he can identify some of the words. Old phrasing, a lullaby that speaks of a mother who will guard her son from the darkness, a song about eternal protection, knowing this song is impossible unless someone taught her. Richard sits in his office, and for the first time in weeks, he looks small, as if he has shrunk inside his own tailored suit. He puts the tablet aside, picks up the phone, makes a call. "I want the results now," he says. "I don't care if it's incomplete." The voice on the other end begins to report. Richard listens without interruption. When it ends, he hangs up. Catherine Marina Miller, 52 years old, born in Oak Creek, orphaned at 18. No criminal record. No living relatives that can be located. Impeccable employment history over 30 years. Excellent references from previous employers. Nothing. Absolutely nothing that explains how she knows that song. He searches for the name of Laura's deceased mother, Dolores Sawyer. Maybe there is a connection. Maybe they are distant cousins. Maybe... nothing. Nothing he can find. Richard keeps watching the recordings. But now there is a shift in how he watches. He is no longer looking for negligence or impropriety. He is looking for clues, for answers, for the key that unlocks the door Catherine seems to be keeping shut. And Catherine, although she doesn't know she is being watched, starts to notice that something has changed. David is the first to notice. At breakfast, he looks at Richard and says, "Dad, you look sad." Richard doesn't answer. He just eats his oatmeal in silence. Catherine watches from outside the kitchen. She is pretending to wipe the counter, but she is really watching father and son. And she sees the disturbance in Richard, that coldness that was always there, but now seems to be cracking. That afternoon, she makes a decision. She knocks on Richard's study door. It is something she rarely does. He prefers privacy. "Can I speak with you, sir?" she asks. Richard looks up from his work. He wasn't working, actually. He was just staring at the wall. Of course, Catherine enters. She clasps her hands in front of her body, that posture of subservience she learned decades ago. "It's about David," she starts. Richard tenses immediately. "The boy is making significant emotional progress," Catherine continues, not noticing the change in his face. "But he still has a lot of fear. He is very traumatized by the loss of his mother, even if he doesn't remember her consciously. I would like to suggest you consider therapy. A good child psychologist could—" "No," Richard interrupts her. "Sir, no. David doesn't need therapy. He needs a father who is strong, who teaches him to deal with reality." "With respect, sir," Catherine says, and there is something in her voice that isn't just deference. There is something maternal. The reality is that he lost his mother, and no amount of toughness will change that. He needs help to process that pain. Richard stands up, his chair scrapes back harshly. "You know what I think?" he says, and now the coldness is returning. But it's a different coldness. It's the coldness of someone who is scared. "I think you are trying to put yourself in his mother's place, that you are using his insecurities to create an inappropriate bond. That is not. And I think," he continues, talking over her, "that you are interfering with my raising of my son. You are a housekeeper, a nanny, not a counselor, not a mother." The word mother comes out like venom. Catherine flinches as if she had been struck. "Do your job, Catherine. Clean, cook, take care of hygiene and basic safety, but do not interfere in my parenting again. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," she murmurs and leaves. Richard falls back into his chair. He feels his heartbeat racing. Because what just happened, this explosion, this cruelty, wasn't about Catherine. It was about fear. It was about the feeling that something he controls is slipping through his fingers, and he doesn't know how to get it back. That night, Richard goes back to the cameras. He isn't looking for evidence of negligence anymore, but the camera is still recording, and it still captures everything. He watches as Catherine puts David to bed. The boy is quieter now, more withdrawn, feeling the chill that came with his father's words. Catherine doesn't sing. She just tucks him under the duvet. But then she does something different. She gets up and goes to the closet. She pushes the clothes aside carefully. Her hand goes to the back where there is a space between the baseboard and the wall. And from there she pulls out a small box. The box is wooden, handmade, with tiny drawings carved into the sides. The same flowers, the same birds, the same crescent moon Richard saw on a wooden crib in an old photo of Laura when she was pregnant. Catherine opens the box slowly. Inside there are things, small things, that Richard can't see completely through the camera, but they seem to be letters? Drawings? Something that makes his heart stop. Catherine holds an object. It appears to be a photo against her chest, and for a moment, just a brief moment, her face is completely visible to the camera. And it is the face of a woman carrying a weight no one should have to carry alone. Richard freezes the image. He sees her, really sees her, perhaps for the first time in his entire life. Not as an employee, but as a person. And then the shock passes, and he goes back to who he was before. Because at the bottom of that wooden box in that photo Catherine holds against her heart, he sees, for just a second before she puts it away again, a baby in the arms of a young woman. A baby that could be anyone, but Richard knows exactly who it is. Richard calls her to the study the next morning. No email, no advance notice, just a short message delivered by David. "Catherine, Dad wants to talk to you in the office." David looks worried when he passes the message. He feels something. Children always feel when something is wrong in the air of a house. Catherine walks down the stairs slowly. Her hands are clean. She was making breakfast, but now they are too clean. So much so that she rubs her fingers against each other nervously as she walks. Richard's study is a room made of dark wood and absolute silence. The heavy drapes are partially drawn, letting only thin lines of light slice across the hardwood floor. Richard is behind his desk, and there is something in his posture that is no longer the master of the house. It is something more predatory. "Close the door," he says. Catherine closes it. The sound of the latch is like a gunshot in slow motion. "Sit down." She sits. The chair is purposely uncomfortable. Richard has a theory that important people shouldn't be comfortable in offices that aren't theirs. "How long have you worked for me, Catherine?" "Almost 9 years, sir." 9 years. And in 9 years you gained my trust. I placed my son, my only son, the only person who matters to me in this world, in your hands. Catherine says nothing. Something in her body begins to tense. "But I discovered recently," Richard continues, standing up and walking slowly around the desk, "that perhaps that trust was misplaced." He places the tablet on the desk, facing her. On the screen is the screenshot from the previous night. Catherine opening David's closet. Catherine holding the wooden box. Catherine with that expression on her face that Richard recognized but doesn't want to name. "What is this?" he asks. Catherine looks at the screen. Her face goes pale. "Sir, I can explain. I don't want an explanation. I want you to get that box from my office now. That belongs to David's past. It is personal. I didn't." "You didn't what?" Richard leans forward. "You didn't what, Catherine? You weren't hiding things from my son, creating a secret relationship full of symbols and objects I didn't authorize. It's not like that." "Then what is it?" His voice is low now, which is worse than if it were loud. "What do you call this?" Catherine takes a deep breath. There are tears forming in her eyes, but she holds them back. That training of a lifetime of women who learned not to cry in front of their superiors. "It is heritage, sir. They are the only things left of David's mother. How do you have things of David's mother?" Richard interrupts her, his voice now loaded with suspicion. "How do you know what belonged to Laura? Did you know her?" "No, sir. You just what?" He circles the desk and towers over her, looking down. "You don't come from the same neighborhood. You didn't frequent the same places. So how do you have these belongings?" "That isn't theft, if that is what you are implying." "I'm not implying anything. I am being direct. How do you have these things?" Catherine closes her eyes. This is the moment. This is the point where everything collapses. And she feels it coming down like an avalanche she saw coming 9 years ago, but could do nothing to avoid. "I need you to give me that box, Catherine, now." "I can't, sir. That is not a question. And even so, my answer is no." Richard looks at her. There is something pure in her refusal, a courage he didn't expect. But the courage doesn't move him. It only enrages him more. "If you don't hand me that box voluntarily," he says, "I will call the police for possession of unauthorized property. I will contact them about how you are hiding evidence in my son's house, and you know exactly how that will end, don't you?" Catherine feels the floor disappear. Because he is right. She has a background of poverty, of a life recorded in few files. An accusation, even a false one, would be enough. And then she would lose everything. She would lose David. She stands up slowly. Without saying a word, she walks up the stairs to David's room. Richard follows her. She opens the closet, pushes the clothes aside, puts her hand in the back and pulls out the wooden box with fingers that tremble so much she almost drops it. She hands it to Richard. He opens the lid. Inside, there are photos. Photos of a young woman. Laura, younger than Richard ever knew her. Laura in clothes he never saw her wear. Laura in places he never knew she frequented. And in one of the photos in particular, Laura holding a baby, a newborn, in her arms, with a smile that is pure love. The baby is David. Richard stands motionless. Because this isn't a photo he took. It isn't a photo that exists in any of his albums. It is a photo that belongs to another time, another world. "Why do you have this?" he asks, but his voice has changed. It isn't fury anymore. It is confusion. Catherine doesn't answer. He continues looking through the box. There is a baby rattle, silver, with the name David engraved. There are yellowed letters, written in elegant feminine handwriting. There is a newspaper clipping that has been carefully preserved. "Empty your pockets," Richard says suddenly. "Sir? Your pockets, now." Catherine turns out her pockets, a quarter, a key, an old, worn leather wallet. The wallet falls to the floor, and when it falls, something slips out. A small newspaper clipping yellowed by time. Richard picks it up. The page is torn. Half the headline is missing, but enough remains. "Fatal crash on Route 9. Survivor in critical." And below, in smaller print, a snippet. A woman and a man were found following a truck collision. The woman was pronounced dead at the scene. The man was transported with severe injuries. A child in the back seat was miraculously spared. Richard looks at Catherine. Her face is ashen. Her eyes are brimming. "Tell me what this means," he whispers. Catherine feels the weight of 9 years of silence on her shoulders. 9 years of carrying a secret that consumes her. 9 years of loving a boy while watching his father destroy himself under the weight of his own emptiness. "Sir," she starts but can't find the words. Because telling the truth is surrendering her life. It is admitting that everything she built here was based on a lie, but staying silent is surrendering it too. Richard puts the newspaper under the desk lamp. He reads again, and suddenly he is seeing dates, seeing names, seeing a pattern he never saw because he never looked. Laura died 7.5 years ago. Catherine was hired 7 years and 3 months ago. And the newspaper clipping, the clipping she kept like a sacred object, is dated exactly 7.5 years ago. The date Laura died. Richard places the newspaper clipping on the desk with both hands, as if handling evidence of a crime. Because, in a way, it is. Evidence of a life he never investigated, of a death he never truly processed, of everything he put in a box, deep at the bottom of his being, and swore never to open again. He goes to the computer. His fingers type with the precision of someone in a trance. Fatal crash Route 9, 2017. The results appear. He clicks on the first link. The report is brief. Because car accidents aren't news unless deaths are involved. Unless there is enough drama to fill half a column in a local paper. Pregnant woman dies in collision. Baby saved in emergency operation. Richard reads every word. His eyes move mechanically as if his brain can't process the information fast enough. Laura Martin, 31, was pronounced dead at the scene. The baby, whose gestation was 8 months along, was delivered via emergency C-section by paramedics and hospital staff. Survived without complications. The only other passenger identified as Marina Martin. The victim's twin sister refused medical assistance after suffering only superficial injuries, left no contact information. Richard stops reading. He looks at Catherine, really looks at her, and suddenly, in a moment that is like a lightning bolt of recognition, he sees everything. The way she tilts her head, exactly like Laura did. The way her fingers touch her mouth when she is scared. Laura did the same. The shape of her eyes, the color of her skin, that small birthmark behind her left ear. Twin sister. Laura had a twin sister he never met, that he didn't even know existed. You, Richard whispers. You were in the car. Catherine can't speak. The sob she held back for so long finally escapes and she covers her face with her hands. You were in the car when she died. Yes, Catherine manages to say between sobs. I was. And you disappeared. You left. You left my son without... I couldn't stay, Catherine screams, and there is fury in her voice now, the fury of someone who has carried the guilt for 7 years. Do you think I wanted to leave that hospital room? Do you think I wanted to leave that boy alone? But I was broken. I saw my sister die. I saw the blood. I saw... She can't finish. Richard sits in the chair. The movement is as if his legs have disappeared. You are Laura's twin sister, Catherine says, her voice now small, broken. My name was Marina. That was my real name, my true name. But after the accident, after giving my statement, I couldn't be anywhere that reminded me of her. So I ran, changed my name, tried to disappear, and now you are here. I came back because I couldn't live without knowing how David was growing up, if he was loved, if he was safe. Tears continue to stream down Catherine's face. I sent letters to you, 5 letters. You never answered. You never acknowledged my sister's existence or my existence even once. You lied to me, for 9 years. Because the truth was too heavy for me to carry alone. And because if I had told you, you would have taken me away from him. You would have made me leave even though I needed to be here. I needed to be the mother Laura couldn't be. Richard stands up. He walks to the window. Behind it, the city keeps passing. People going to work, children going to school. A normal life moving forward while his explodes in his fingers. You knew her, he says suddenly. David's mother. You were her sister. And I never knew. She never told me. She was ashamed, Catherine says softly. Laura was ashamed of our family. We were poor. We were nobody. And you were everything she wanted to become. Richard places his hand against the glass of the window. It is cold. Everything is cold. That song, he says slowly. The one you sing to David. It was our mother's. Our mother sang it to us when we were little. Laura couldn't forget it. She sang it to David when she was pregnant. I hear it in his eyes. He knows it from before he was born. Richard closes his eyes, and suddenly he is seeing Laura. No, not Laura. Marina. Marina in every moment he knew her. Laura working as a florist in the shop near his office. Laura who he courted because she was beautiful and poor, and gratitude kept him hooked. Laura who died in a car accident while driving alone. Or not alone. Never alone. With her sister. Her twin sister Laura never mentioned because Laura was ashamed of her own origins. David, Richard whispers. Did David know about you? He knows I am his aunt, Catherine says. Because it was the only truth I could keep. He calls me aunt sometimes when he is sleeping. When he isn't afraid, you will hear him. And it is in this exact moment, when Richard finally comprehends the depth of the lie, the depth of the truth, the depth of the pain that has existed for so long, that the office door opens. David is there. His face is small, confused, scared. He saw his father yelling, saw Aunt Catherine crying, and now he is here, in that space where 2 people are crumbling, and he doesn't understand why. Dad, he says, his voice fragile as glass. Why are you making Aunt Catherine cry? Richard looks at his son, and he sees for the first time since he was born, not an obstacle to his own grief. He sees a boy who knows his aunt, a boy who is loved by someone who isn't him, a boy who survived because his aunt was in that car, a boy who never should have existed, and now Richard understands why David is less weak, understands why he has less fear, understands why he smiles when he sings that song. Because he has a mother. Not in the sense Richard meant, but in the sense that matters, in the sense he always wanted to have. David leaves the spot where he stands and goes to Catherine. His small face buries itself against her chest, and she hugs him as if this hug were the first and the last she will ever give. Richard watches, and slumps into the chair, not because he is furious, but because finally, he is seeing clearly. Richard doesn't leave the study that night. David and Catherine go down to eat dinner alone. He stays there in the chair with the newspaper clipping in his hands. He reads and rereads the same report until the words lose their meaning and become just sounds. When he finally goes up to his room, the silence in the house is absolute. The next morning, he looks for Catherine in the kitchen. She is making coffee, the same coffee she has made for 9 years with the same precision, the same care. She doesn't see him arrive. "Catherine," he says. She turns. Her eyes are swollen from crying. She spent the night awake, waiting to be fired, waiting to be removed from David's life, waiting for the end. "I'm not going to apologize right now," Richard says. It isn't what she expected to hear, because words are empty. "But I want you to know that I understand." Catherine doesn't answer, she just watches him. "You were in that car, you saw my wife die, and instead of telling me, instead of letting me hate you for it, you decided to stay. You decided to be here, for him." He holds the wooden box, the one he forced her to open, the one she guarded like a treasure. And he hands it to her. "This is yours. It belongs to you. And it belongs to David. When he is ready to hear the truth, you two will tell him together. On your terms. In your time." Catherine takes the box with trembling hands. "There is something I want to show you," Richard continues, "if you are willing." He leads her through the house. They pass the hallway where David is watching cartoons, completely unaware of the reconstruction happening around him. They pass the stairs, and finally arrive at a door Richard hasn't opened in years. It is Laura's room. He opens the door slowly. The air inside is stagnant, the air of a place sealed from time. The curtains are drawn. A bouquet of flowers died a long time ago in a vase on the vanity. Clothes still hang in the wardrobe, clothes Laura will never wear again. "I closed it," Richard says, and his voice is so low it can barely be heard. "After she died, I simply closed it, because if I didn't see it, then maybe it wasn't true." Catherine enters the room. She walks like she is in a dream. Her fingers touch the bed where Laura slept. Touch the pillow where Laura laid her head. That blouse, she points to a hanger. She wore that to work. She complained it was too hot, but it was the only one she had that didn't have tears. Richard looks at her, and sees for the first time not the nanny he hired. He sees the woman who lost her sister. He sees someone who carried that grief completely alone. "You can stay here," he says. "Stay here as long as you need." Catherine sits on the bed and cries, not the contained crying of before, but the full crying of someone who can finally allow herself to feel. Richard sits beside her, not too close, but close enough for her to know she isn't alone. Hours later, when the sun begins to set, Richard calls David to his study again. This time, Catherine is sitting next to him. "David," Richard begins, and there is something in his voice that has changed. "There is something you need to know about your Aunt Catherine." David looks at them, his small hands gripping the edge of the chair. "Your Aunt Catherine," Richard continues, searching for the right words, "is your mother's twin sister, the mother you never knew. They looked very much alike, and your aunt has loved you since before you were born." David processes this. His face goes through several expressions. Confusion, understanding, and then something like relief. "So she is like a mom?" he asks. Richard looks at Catherine, and she looks at Richard. "Yes," Catherine says, her voice trembling. "I am like a mom, if you want me to be." David gets out of the chair and goes to Catherine. He wraps his arms around her neck. "I want you to be," he whispers. In the months that follow, the house changes. Richard hires a lawyer. The will is rewritten. Catherine is named as joint legal guardian of David, not as an employee, as family. Her rights are documented. Her benefits are retroactive to the first day she arrived at the house, because Richard recognizes that is the least he can do. But the most important change isn't in any document. It is in how the house sounds now. There is laughter. There is music. That old lullaby which now Richard hears and no longer wants to turn off. There are conversations in low voices after David sleeps. Richard and Catherine sharing stories about Laura. Stories Richard never knew. Stories of a woman he loved but never truly knew. One night, a few months later, David wakes up with a nightmare. It is a small nightmare, just one that makes his eyes pop open suddenly. He lies in bed for a moment, breathing heavily, letting the fear pass. Then he gets up. He walks down the dark hallway, a hallway he knows by heart now because he learned there is nothing to fear there. He goes down the stairs, barefoot, silently. And when he reaches the living room, he sees his father and his aunt are sitting on the sofa. There is a cup of tea on the coffee table between them. 2 cups, actually. They are talking in whispers, but it isn't a tense conversation. It is a conversation coming from a place of understanding, of slow healing. David stands in the doorway for a moment just watching, and then he smiles. Because he understands, in that way children understand things adults take a lifetime to figure out. That this is family. It isn't perfect. It isn't without pain, but it is real, and it is his. He goes back to bed and sleeps deeply, the kind of sleep that comes after understanding you are safe. The next morning, Richard does something he had never done. He enters the office and looks at the cameras, 5 of them. That recorded every moment of Catherine and David, that documented every act of love he wanted to punish. He turns off each one of them. Then he covers them with a white cloth. And over that cloth, he places a photograph. An old photograph found in Laura's room. In it, 2 girls are laughing, twins, identical, arm in arm. They are next to a window and the sunlight hits their faces. They are completely young, completely happy, completely together. Surveillance has given way to trust. And that night when David has another nightmare, because children keep having nightmares, because that doesn't change overnight, he doesn't run alone into the dark hallway. His father hugs him. His aunt holds his hand. And the lullaby, that song that crossed 2 lives and now touches a 3rd, fills the entire house. This story teaches us that the truths we hide don't disappear. They only grow in the darkness. And that sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do isn't to maintain control, but to surrender to the possibility that he was wrong. That family isn't just blood or legal paperwork. It is presence. It is the sacrifice of someone who stays when they could have left. If you like emotional stories like this, stories about redemption, forgiveness, and the families we build through the courage to tell the truth, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Because here we believe no one is so lost they cannot be found.